a pleasure, always a delight, and an honor to welcome you as we continue to unpack the socioeconomic ramifications and impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war on African economies. So today, we are hosting session 13 of the series, which we launched last November. And for today's discussion, we will look at the impacts on commodity markets in Uganda. Please go to the chat, tell us your name, tell us the organization you represent and where you're joining us from, and what you hope to see during this session. As always, we are counting on you for a highly interactive and engaging session. You know the drill. If you have any questions, any observations which you would like to be discussed during this session, kindly head to the Q&A and let us know your thoughts. And as usual, we strongly encourage you to raise your hand if you want to intervene live. So please, if you have any interventions during the Q&A segment of this session, kindly raise your hand and the moderator will invite you. As always, we are providing simultaneous interpretation in English and French. If you need this function, kindly click on the globe icon on your screen and choose the language track of your choice. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator for today's session. He's the head of policy and advocacy at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. Please welcome Mr. Boaz Kaizire.
Thank you so much, Lair, and welcome everybody. I see many people still joining in, trying to join the webinar. I would like also to start by appreciating the work that is being done largely by academia on this particular topic, where trying really to understand the impact of Russia-Ukraine crisis on various issues. So today we will be listening more specifically on the crisis effects on the commodity prices, but also in Uganda's local markets. So that's how this particular discussion has been tailored. But as you may really understand, and I think as Laira mentioned earlier, there are a series of studies that have been made. The impact is beyond the prices alone. And our colleague, Paul Miner, has helped to put together a lot of really very excellent analysis. And I don't want to bias everybody by interpreting what the analysis is. I say excellent based on where I'm coming from, because when I'm looking for solutions, I find them in some of these very well articulated pieces. So thanks, Paul, for putting this together and leading the team that has been trying to write about this. So we have limited time, and therefore I would request that we go straight to the discussion and the presentation, starting with Paul, taking us through how you went through about this, what are the outcomes, what are the implications, and then we'll open it up for discussions, make sure that people are able to really understand what exactly happens. So without wasting time, Paul, welcome to the team, and I'm sure the number will keep increasing, but as Lai mentioned, we can get comments, reflection in the chat, and at some stage, given the time, we'll open it up for more input from the rest of the colleagues. Thank you so much, and over to you, Paul.
Okay, so thank you very much, Boaz, and also Lai, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. It's a pleasure to present this piece of work that was done early part of last year on the impact of Ukraine-Russia crisis on commodity prices in local markets in Uganda. And I presume that you all can see my screen. So, and I wanted to begin by saying that the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war in early part of last year, beginning late February, affected global trade by disrupting supply chains that led to a hike or a rise in commodity prices of many staples and also energy prices across the globe. And we also know that these impacts were transmitted to varying extents to domestic markets across Africa. Varying extent by depending on whether the country concerned was directly importing from Russia or Ukraine, or whether the country was heavily dependent on those import etc. But why is the crisis of significance to the continent? because the main antagonists in this conflict are major players in the global trade. Collectively, about 25% of all wheat and 15% of maize that is traded globally come from these countries. We also know that there are major players in the fertilizer, oil and natural gas. And we also know that many countries in our continent rely on the imports from these countries to meet local demand. And even those that do not rely directly at imports from those countries, when the Ukraine-Russia crisis came, there was also disruption because countries, third-party countries tended to kind of hoard, and therefore they would also feel the effect through contagion effect transmitted through the countries that are primary trading partners. But we also know when a situation like this arises, there is need to protect the welfare of the affected people, and therefore governments need to know really what is going on. So that is sort of the rationale behind that. All right. And it was expected that the prices would remain higher, of course, after the war started, and were likely to remain high, at least in the medium term, depending on how that crisis evolved. So we are a year into it, and the main antagonists are still at it, and therefore we don't know how that situation ultimately will be sorted out. And while many adjustments have happened in many countries by looking at alternative sources of these commodities and maybe some adjustment here and there, the effect, we may live with it for a long time to come. So here we are looking at prices. And maybe as a way of putting this in context, when you are thinking of prices over time, so maybe 3 dimensions become of interest. First of all, is just looking at the trends. How are these prices changing over time? Because we know that prices do change over time. Some are affected by seasonalities, others are affected by other shocks, etc. But just knowing how prices are evolving over time in terms of trend analysis is important. There are also situations where a shock or a change can be so major that it brings about a structural change in the long-term evolution of prices. And that is also something that would be of interest. There's also an element of volatility, how even as prices are changing, there may be a lot of swings up and down, which cause a lot of uncertainty in the market. So these 3 dimensions are important. But for us in this particular study, we are just limited to the first part of this and the trend analysis, because as I mentioned, of course, and as we all know, the prices set in around early last year. And this brief was prepared just like 6 or so months or 7 months into the crisis, because we only had a very a short series of data about initial 5 to 6 months. But since that time, we have gotten additional data till the end of the year. And therefore, we have a little bit more to say over time. But it is basically saying what was happening in Uganda in these markets for these commodities that I'll be mentioning, especially compared with what we were observing at the global level. Were there any patterns of co-movement? Were there patterns of transmission of those changes in price? So I think that is sort of the delineation of the analysis. We know that normally when one has very long-term price data, you can do more. You can do more detailed analysis. But for this, we limited to just check at the trends as they were evolving. So in terms of the import situation or import dependence, we know that Uganda imports substantial amounts of wheat, rice, sugar, and cooking oil to bridge the deficit in local demand. Some of these products are produced in the country, but not in amounts that are enough to meet local demand, and therefore imports come in to bridge the deficit. Of course, for oil, energy products like petrol, diesel, liquefied petroleum gas, or cooking gas, they are all imported, more or less. So in just using the example of the year 2020, wheat was the 6th most imported commodity into the country, into Uganda. Over 620,000 metric tons were imported, and bulk of that came from Russia. In 2020, sugar imports into Uganda were valued at over $51 million coming from India, Egypt, among other countries. The same year, rice was the 9th most imported commodity. This is more imported locally, about 70% coming from Tanzania, but also the remaining amount coming from Asian countries such as Pakistan and Thailand. And about 50% of cooking oil was also imported, mainly from Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. And therefore, we have a situation of a country that is quite dependent on import for these commodities to meet local demand, and therefore this would make the country in a way vulnerable to the global price fluctuations. So in terms of the data that we used, for Kampala, the data is recorded in weekly, and therefore we had the weekly price data for Kampala, but for other markets that we consider, that is Mbarara, Mbale, and Gulu, the data was monthly, and we selected the commodities that I've mentioned: rice, sugar, wheat flour, and cooking oil. And for energy commodities, we had petrol, diesel, and cooking gas. And of course, it's recorded depending on the commodity, Uganda shillings per kilo of the dry commodities, and we converted the others, especially for cooking oil and fuel, especially liquefied petroleum gas, so that the price, it's not Kenya shillings, but rather Uganda shillings per liter. And the data was obtained from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, that is the agency responsible for collecting and compiling these official statistics. As I mentioned, the initial analysis tracked the prices from January to June for Kampala and January to May for the other 3 markets. But since then, since the publication of that brief, we have had data for the additional months or the remaining months of the year. And in this presentation, we'll be seeing whether the initial trend maintained or not. I think for point 1, I have already mentioned the global prices with which we were comparing the changes in the country is obtained from the World Bank Commodity Market Outlook data that estimates about monthly prices for about 46 commodities. And therefore, we'll be showing how these changes in the prices in the local market coincide with the global price movement, or to the extent to which a local context or situation, such as production in the local market, affect those prices. So let me begin by showing what we found with these food prices in Kampala. The red line I have drawn is what we had by the time of publication of the brief, because it was up to June. And we noticed that some increases were noted. For example, for cooking oil, which is the line above, the trend was that by the end of June, the prices were found to have increased by about 41%. And there were just 2 incidences of hikes. The first one happening around February, the prices remaining more or less stable, and then another one happening around the 4th week of May. And then, as you can see, these remain relatively stable up to some time in September when there was a dip, and then another dip in November. But again, in December, we see a hike in price going up to quite a high level by the end of the year. So in essence, by the end of the year, the oil prices were about 24% higher than they were at the beginning. And then the price of wheat rose modestly by about 6% from the first week of January to the fourth week of June. And by the fourth week in December, this had increased by about 24%. Sugar prices rose by about 39% between January and June, and they remained high over that period. And by the last week of December, they had increased by 61% compared to the levels they were at the beginning of the year. Then another urban market in Mbarara, the wheat prices rose only modestly in the initial part of the year between January and May by about 8%. Then they continued to rise a little bit up to sometime in between September and November. They were relatively stable and a little dip during December, but at the end of the day, they were still higher by about 23% compared to the level they were in January. The same case with sugar prices that between January and May rose by 18%, remained relatively stable to the very end of the year. The price of rice remained relatively stable in January to May, and this is because of the local rice production dynamics, we believe, because this is one of the areas where rice production does happen. But by end of the year, it was higher by about 38%. The cooking oil prices rose between January and May by 11%, and by December, still about the same level, 10% higher compared to the levels they were in January because of the decline in the month of November. Okay, if we turn to the rural markets, we have two in Mbale and Gulu. So we notice that in the January to May period, the wheat prices rose modestly by about 8%, but by December, they had increased by about 15%. Sugar prices rose by 18% over the same period, January to May, remained stable. But by end of December, they had really increased by a whole 60% compared to the levels in January. The price of rice, again, in this area were relatively stable in the initial part of the year, January to May, but by December, they had increased by about 25%. And we see at similar, the cooking oil prices show a similar trend as in the other market, an increase of about 11% January, May, remaining relatively stable and being only about 10% higher in December compared to January. When we come to Gulu in the north, the January-May period, the wheat prices also rose by about 8%. And then by December, they had increased a little bit to being 15% higher than what they were in January. Sugar rose by about 21% over the January-May period, but rose quite sharply. By December, they were about 45% of the level higher than they were in January. In Gulu, the price rose in the initial part of the year, but remained relatively stable in the remaining part of the year up to December. The cooking oil prices rose by about 30%, and during the initial period, Jan to May, and by December, they were still high by about 30% to what they were at the beginning of the year in January. Let's now turn to prices of energy and the behavior that we observed. So by May, the fuel prices had risen. Diesel was up 30%, petrol 22%, and cooking gas 24%. By December, the price was still higher compared to January. Diesel was still 29% higher, petrol 16%, and LPG had really increased by up to 55% to the levels that they were at the beginning of the year. Now, when we compare these prices changes that we are observing, how do they compare with the changes that we were observing at the global level? And here I've just taken the urban market in Kampala, and I'm trying to compare that with the market, a rural market in Gulu. So the price change for some commodities, you see sort of a similar pattern with what is happening at the global level, and for some, that is not the case. And I think where that is not the case, then we can only probably infer to the local dynamics that influence prices. For example, the price of wheat during the January to May season globally rose by 40%, but we only saw about 6% increase in Kampala. For sugar, globally it increased by 3%, but locally the price even rose higher, 39% in Kampala and about 21% in Gulu. The rice prices globally increased by about 10%, but we saw a much higher increase locally by 34% in urban market in Kampala and 46% in the rural market of Gulu. The cooking oil increased by about 19% at the global level. It was high in Kampala by about 41% and about 30% in Gulu. The fuel prices, the price of crude had increased by about 31% globally, and we saw some correspondence within the city of Kampala, where petrol was increased by 30%, diesel increased by a higher percent of 45%, and then in the rural area, the increase was a bit modest at 12%. For the natural gas or liquefied petroleum gas, by May of last year, globally, the prices were up almost 30%, and we saw a similar trend or a similar increase within the markets of Kampala and Gulu of 24% and 27% respectively. So for commodities that the country is less dependent on the global market, you would expect, of course, the local dynamics of production would help sort of dampen the increase in the prices. But for commodities that the country is really dependent on global market, the transmission of the prices would be more pronounced. So I think that here, I think it's a summary of what I have just explained in the previous slide, but that evidence of some strong transmissibility, especially of the energy prices from global to local market, is important, because it means that the country will be vulnerable to international trade shocks. and therefore the need for local policies and strategies that are aimed at dampening the effects of such shocks to consumers would be very critical. And I think these are sort of the concluding remarks that we found that there has been, in general, a rise in food and energy commodities in the prices of those in Uganda, reflective of similar changes at the global level. Some commodities, actually, the prices seem to have risen even higher than what was the average global price changes. And therefore, this coming at the back of the previous COVID prices that also had effect on local prices, I think it is important for measures to continue to protect the socially or the most vulnerable groups in the society. But in the long term, for the country to be able to deal with the effects of these global shocks, first, I think more freer regional trade is important, because that would actually help dampen the effects and lessen the dependence on the global markets for these commodities, and therefore shield the country from those shocks. But I think also it's important to continue to boost agricultural production within the country, because with the increase in population and also changing in diet patterns, for example, more consumption of wheat products, it is important that the country increases the production of those commodities. And also in the long term, it is also important to continue to invest in energy efficient or energy saving technologies, so that we become better in using the energy energy resources that we have, and sort of try and shield ourselves, our countries, from these shocks whenever they happen, because they are bound to happen. And individually as countries, we are not able to make them not happen, but we can be better prepared to deal with the ramifications when they do. So I think those that brings me to the end of this presentation. And I thank you all for listening, and I return it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Paul, for really a very, very well prepared piece, both in terms of research, but also the way you've communicated it to us. And I think you've raised the very fundamental issues relating to some of the commodities, as you explained, are the products that could actually have been produced on the continent itself, or even within Uganda, like wheat, rice, soybean, or even other edible oil products. And yet you could really see the diversity of prices and how they are moving across different cities, depending on where you were, and the implications that you've just explained. So I'd like to open this up for discussion. Colleagues online, the floor is open. Let's just have reflections. You can type the question in the chat. You can also voice it over. If we can see by raising your hands, you can contribute to this discussion. And the intention here is, let's enrich the research. What are you seeing that is outside the research that this kind of piece of work should have learned from, or should really have picked? How strong are the recommendations, and how should policymakers in Uganda be able to pick this up to take it forward? Because that's really the utility of this work, to be able to make sure that it's used beyond having a publication. So I would really like to open it up for comments or reflections, if they are there, and then we are able to respond to them directly.
Boaz, there are 2 hands raised right now. Okay.
I can see hands from Julie Collins as well as Martin Fowler. So I will start with Julie. And please, Julie, make your point and question, comment, reflection on this. Over to you.
Thank you, Boaz, and thank you, Paul, for the very interesting presentation. And I have a question, I think, either for Paul or for anybody else among the participants who might have some insight. I was just curious on if we have any ideas of why some commodities had higher price increases than in Uganda than the global price increases, like the cooking oil and rice. which rose quite a lot more in Uganda. Just curious if we have any, if we have any ideas of what might be behind that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Judy. And please, colleagues, can you also mention your name, both where you come from, where you work, so that we can be able to link the questions on how we can use them forward. So if you can also mention where you work, that would be helpful. Julie, do you want to mention it again?
This is Julie Collins. I'm at Academia 2063 and based in Washington, D.C. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. Over to you, Martin. Take it up.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much, Boaz. Good afternoon, Paul. Martin Fowler here. I work for USAID as agricultural advisor. It's an area that we've been looking at quite a lot, as you're probably aware. I mean, just a couple of comments. The point raised by the last speaker is quite an interesting one. Wheat is very insignificant in the domestic market in Uganda. It's mainly eaten by the middle class in Kampala and the other urban areas. So it accounts for 5% of domestic grain expenditure and 6% of total food expenditure. So it's pretty small, really, compared with many other countries. We're very lucky in that respect, which is perhaps why overall sort of poverty levels haven't really increased dramatically as a result of the war in Ukraine. But you looked at I feel your analysis is only over a very short period of time. A lot of the conclusions are based just on the 5-month period. I think you'll find not the year. I think it was slide 6 where you showed those changes, and that when I looked, I realized you were only talking about January to May. So I think we found quite a lot of different conclusions arising from looking at the whole year since the war began. Your recommendation that we need to dampen the shocks is all very well, but there's a great cost to the economy of doing that. So I think, for example, Kenya tried to introduce some price control measures and some subsidies, and that was soon dropped when they realized how expensive it was, both for fuel and for maize. And then you talk about freer trade. I mean, I think Uganda, I think Boaz will agree with me, Uganda has one of the freest trade regimes in the world. So I don't quite know what else we could do to make our trade freer here in Uganda. But anyway, I found the analysis very interesting, and like all these presentations, I'd really like to come back to you afterwards to talk about some of your conclusions once I've had a chance to read them and digest them better. But thanks very much indeed. It was very interesting.
Thank you so much, Martin, for those wonderful comments. Maybe, Paul, I could also just, as you respond to these comments, reflect, as Martin mentioned, wheat is insignificant in the country, but we know that some of the other wheat products are largely consumed, like spaghetti, like cakes. All these are part of the products that are largely consumed by different age groups in the country, but they may draw their ingredients from wheat itself. Maybe that part of it. But what I think was extremely interesting also was, which you can touch on, where I think here you are discussing some of the products, the triggers in some of the months. You would see prices like in April, as you mentioned, would just go a little bit up and then come back to normal. And then maybe in September, maybe you can also explain what were the triggers for those price changes in particular periods, and then they resort back to normal. What were those? And I think you chose the key commodities that were largely imported from Russia, Ukraine, and that part of the region. It would have been interesting if you also looked at other related products like fertilizer mainly, because we've been discussing and tracking fertilizer imports as well as over and above these particular commodities. If you have any comments on this, then it would be helpful for us and people who are on the call to hear from what you're saying. So I'll leave it to you, Paul, to respond to some of these comments. Hopefully during the period, we'll be able to get some more exciting ideas that people want to ask more questions, and we'll also be monitoring the chat to see whether there are additional comments that are coming through. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to Julie, to Martin Fowler, and also yourself, Boaz, for both the comments and the questions. I will do my best to respond to each of them to the best extent possible. So I think Julie's question was about the price changes that we were observing in the markets in Uganda compared to those in the global scene, and why for some commodities there was really such large dispersions, either on the positive side or the negative side. I think part of it has been partly answered by Martin's comment. For example, we said the global price change between that period, beginning of the year to May, the increase was about 40% globally. But for Uganda, it was rather small, I think about 6 or so percent. This, of course, is partly explained by the levels of consumption of that commodity within the country. I think he said compared, of course, to other grains and other staples, there's the consumption level for now is low, and therefore the transmission of those prices from the global to local is likely to be small, because it also means that the substitution is easy, because people can stop taking spaghetti and bread. I think Boaz does remember a comment by His Excellency the President encouraging people in Uganda that you don't have just to eat bread, you can eat the local staples like cassava and others. Sort of, I mean, the essence of that comment is that you can substitute, and that could explain why for some of this, the price change is rather small. But for others, like cooking oil, we see quite an increase. The dynamics there, I can't quite pin them down, but remember, when a shock like this happens, most countries sort of triggers a panic within even the exporting countries, and they tend to hoard what they have. And therefore, for countries, like say Uganda, which has to get its oil from Malaysia or from Indonesia, it becomes a bit more probably difficult, and therefore the increase in local price go up a bit more. But I think to pin that down, one would need a little bit more analysis there. And I want to tie the point that Boaz, you mentioned. Some of these commodities or staples that have not traditionally been high on the list of most consumed. I think with the changes in diet, with the changes in composition of what people consume and increase in income, maybe in future we may see more of that being consumed. Maybe not directly in bread, but also in other processed commodities, derivatives, like you mentioned, spaghetti, cakes, and other confectionaries that are made from wheat. And therefore, I guess, while for now it may not be very top, I think going into the future, it's not something that we can ignore. And furthermore, there is a lot of market in the region. I would say, for example, Kenya, we import about almost 2 million metric tons of wheat every year. So if Uganda can produce more of that and sell to us the way they sell maize, I think there's a ready market in the region for that. So I think for Martin, I think you said, yes, the limitation, of course, was that we had very few months of study. And I think what we were trying to do, we were trying to combine what the rigors of research would call, have more data, have more information before you make any conclusion, but also balancing with the fact that decisions are made by policymakers, debates do happen, whether there is in-depth analysis or not, decisions are always made. And therefore, maybe sometime having some semblance of analysis that is telling part of the story is also important to shed light to the conversation, because already those were conversations that were going on within government policy circles. How do we deal with the increase in the price of wheat? What do we do with these rising prices in energy and other commodities? So I think that's what we are trying to do. But as you say clearly, with more data coming in, then we can do more in-depth analysis, and probably for us, even going back and comparing the historical price data and seeing what that trigger of Ukraine means on the long-term price changes. In terms of measures, you are right. These measures are always tricky, and they have to be really targeted and for a limited period of time. If you are going to subsidize fuel, if you can subsidize to the most needy and make it very efficient, the better. And then it has to be not for an elongated period of time, because then it becomes very costly to the economy. And consumption is not the best way to deal with some of these problem from the government side. I agree with you. The freer trade, it is true. I think Uganda stands as one of the countries in the EAC and this region that has free trade. Kudos to that. We can only encourage that it remains so, so that both Uganda and other countries do benefit. Then, Boaz, you mentioned about other commodities, because the set of commodities that we report here are fewer. I think the other pieces of work that were dealing with fertilizer that were done by academia, I can't confirm whether fertilizer was one of such, but there is another work stream that I think were dealing with inputs, particularly fertilizer, and we could check whether there's something for Uganda there. I think yes, I think you asked the question about these spikes or drops in the trend line that we are observing, and what causes them. I think that would require a little bit. We may not be able to answer very specifically for each one of them, but in general, they would reflect the changing dynamics, because when the prices go up, of course, some adjustments do happen in the economy. Alternative sources of imports come in to bridge the deficit, and therefore prices may go down, or during the process of adjustment, prices may go up. Therefore, those are the general drivers of those increases and decreases in price. But for specific commodities, one would have to have very specific information. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Keep monitoring whether there are additional hands, but as we try to dig deep into this, we still have a few 15 minutes to close of the hour. Paul, what came into my mind as we discussed was really looking at the long-term recommendations. Some of them, boosting agricultural production. Martin, you rightly mentioned that, and we've done this, that Uganda is one of the countries that has a relatively free trade policy regime across the region, across the continent, and beyond. This has been studied through our political economy analysis. The challenge for a recommendation like boosting agricultural production comes on to why is it not happening? What are exactly the challenges in some of these commodities? And I want to pick some of the few, like soybean, which could be part of the sources of oil for the country. And Uganda is one of the countries that has the largest comparative advantage on producing soybean, the most demanded product on the continent that feeds into the poultry industry, to the livestock industry, but also speaking to the issues related to oil and consumable oil products. I think it would be important also to understand what are those particular challenges that are not facilitating boosting production in the areas that we are concerned about. Such as, like, for example, is it because of lack of the right hybrid seed varieties? Is it the extension that is fading? Is it because of lack of other infrastructure investments like irrigation? What are those particular areas, and what should policymakers be concerned about? If I'm sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Finance, I want to hear what exactly the constraints are, such that I'll be able to provide policy responses that can be able to really respond to some of these areas. So, and this is not a question due for you to answer, but we can reflect on them as we concretize and finalize. What exactly should government be doing differently? And I think one of the comments that you raise here is about protect the vulnerable through social safety nets, because prices are likely to remain high or even stabilize at higher level. Some of the price changes are also affected by the non-agricultural related interventions, the macroeconomic effects, increasing debt and others. So I think it would be very critical to reflect on some of these and how government should be readjusting specific policy choices to respond to these challenges. Yeah. If you have any comments, you may raise them, but let's first check on whether there's any additional comments.
There was a hand from Antoinette Sala.
Okay, Sarah, do you want to take it away from here?
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gutiga. It was a very informative and detailed presentation. Thank you also for the other participants. My question is focusing on access to data. How difficult was it to collect your data in terms of the public sector, in terms of from the private sector, from the farmers, and also the consumer? Were there any restriction in accessing the data you've presented? Thank you.
Boaz, I have a quick one too.
Sure.
Not so far. Yeah, not so far from yours. Paul, you touched a little bit on some recommendations for the government, and I would like to find out if in your research, you saw any evidence of, the government adopting policies or measures that were useful during COVID, notably to boost agricultural production to help fight such crises and shocks. Thank you.
Paul, is this?
Yes.
Yeah, you may need to respond to those, and then we see how we take it from there.
Okay, so thank you everyone for the questions and the comment. Let me start with Salah's question on the access to data. So I think I did mention that this data was obtained from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. We had to engage someone in country who helped gather the data. So this data, of course, is collected by the Bureau as part of their mandate to collect price data. So as I mentioned, in the city of Kampala, they collect this data weekly. And in several markets and for many commodities, not just the one that we analyzed here, but beyond. And therefore it is available. We just needed to have someone in the country with the mandate to basically get the data from the official sources. And he was able to get that, the initial source up to the initial data up to May, and later on, as the data came in, we were provided with that data up to December. So the government does collect data, and therefore the availability of this data is not, I think, an issue. It is there, it's available in the government offices. Of course, now one has to request for it using the official channels, and that I think was not a problem. So there are two others. I think Lai is asking about the evidence of government interventions in really addressing this crisis. I think there were many things. In fact, remember this work for us from academia side is a follow-up of what the governments were doing during the COVID time. In fact, the COVID time, we had a bit more, I think, time on our hands, where we looked at the historical price data and we were able to really, if you like, disentangle the effects of COVID really on these prices by looking at controlling for the usual seasonal changes in prices, the long term, and seeing whether really COVID was having an effect. But at the same time, we were also following on the policy decisions and things that the government were doing to protect the vulnerable. And indeed, there were quite a number of measures, social protection, provision of food to the most vulnerable people. There were quite a number of them. Some, of course, have been dropped along the way because as the effect of the COVID has continued to ease up and people have been allowed now more to go out and engage in economic activities. I think a lot of those have been eased out along the way. But there are many lessons, I think, that can be learned from what the government was doing during that period of a crisis like that can help them better target the people that need the help the most. Now, in terms of what Boaz you are saying, I think first, if you are to learn, first of all, at the continental level, I would want to say that since the mid-90s up to just before COVID, I think the agricultural sector in the continent has been on a recovery trend. We have observed an upsurge in growth. We have seen productivity growing of land, of labor. We have seen real changes happening that were going good for agriculture. And even by the time COVID was coming, while the initial rate of growth had slowed down a little bit, and for some countries it has now become maybe downward, there were certain things that we were doing as countries, especially through CADEP, that seemed to have been working. Because since the message of CADEP of making agriculture the center of economic growth, not neglecting it, being focused on using evidence to inform our decision, being serious about collecting data and monitoring whether policies are working or not, bringing everyone on board, all the stakeholders, and working together, I think some things had started changing. Some good things had begun happening. And I think what we need to do is to go back a little bit for each country, of course, because data now is available. What were we doing right so that we don't blame this crisis for everything that has happened? What were we doing right when growth was happening? When we were having reduction in poverty, when we were having reduction in number of malnourished people, what is it we were doing and how can we do it even more effectively and better going forward? Otherwise, I think the solutions to our challenges are there. The information and knowledge is there. It's just contextualizing it to each country and to each sector. And of course, aligning our intervention with our goals. If the goal is to increase employment, you know what you need to do. If the goal is to reduce poverty, then you know what you need to do because you know where poverty is and where most poor people are. So I think there is, then the other thing is consistency. There is no magic to it. You can't achieve it in 1 year. You have to be consistent in doing the right thing over time so that we can sustain the gains that we have observed. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I know that we are just only 4 minutes away from the close of the time, but I also noticed Martin Farah has expressed some comments on the chat and we can reflect on them. He's talking about, the governments themselves should be excited about the impact of these prices and the impact of different interventions and like this, be able to trigger their own analysis and research and be able to engage them in government. I think one of the points that we should pick up as we conclude this piece is the extent to which these decisions can reach the policymakers. I was also trying to monitor how many people were on the call and who of these are really policymakers, who is getting concerned about the increase in prices, in whose minds is this being infused. And as you will notice that we commissioned part of this work to make sure that it informs our government engagement role. I think we have really a lot of good material that we can begin to work with in terms of translating and consolidating this analysis and evidence for various decision makers, either at the Ministry of Finance level, because some of these decisions are beyond the Ministry of Agriculture. It doesn't take a quick policy fix to be able to understand what is required to be able to trigger the economy and expand the economy to grow and allow some of these products to be either produced locally or even imported at a competitive basis to make sure that you are able to monitor and track prices, especially for those whose income stabilizes at a lower level and their prices increase, they are definitely affected. And they may not be your target for the social safety net programs that we are talking about, but they are losers and winners from all these particular products. So we take note of very excellent piece of work that is coming, and I know that there's a series of policy briefs that have been developed and webinars that are coming up for discussing them, and I think we are really excited to see what is emerging and happy to know that you've been able to take up this piece of work. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for academia for leading this work. And I want to turn it back to Lail for final reflections before we close it in the next 2 minutes. Over to you, Lail.
Thank you so much for that very exciting conversation. Thank you, Boaz, for agreeing to moderate this session. And thank you once again, Paul, for your wonderful presentation. So we've come to the end of session 13 of the Academia 2063 Ukraine Crisis webinar series. Please check the chat. We have shared the link to brief 19, which was the basis of this conversation. The brief is available in English and French. Kindly visit Academia 2063's Ukraine Crisis portal at academia2063.com and download any brief of interest to you. Join us same time next week for session 14, where we will be discussing exposure to global commodity trade and market disruptions, impact on growth, poverty, and food security in Malawi, with a presentation by Dr. Ismail Fofana, Director of Capacity and Deployment at Academia 2063. And the session will be moderated by Dr. John Ulimwengu, Senior Research Fellow at XIII. Please go to our slide share. The link is available in the chat. On that slide share, you're going to have access to all the PowerPoint presentations from this webinar series. And of course, join the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn at Academia 2063. Thank you all and see you same time next week. Take care. Bye.
And bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Boaz. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
I look for you in town for make sure that we discuss this further.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.